2. Thanks for joining me again. This one's going to be kicked off with a discussion about Rabbit Proof Fence. It's a really interesting film. It's a film that has a very clear and somewhat simple narrative that's around the experience of three young girls and other people as well who are depicted in it, who were stolen from their homes and then had to find their way back home. And it's about the complexity of their relationship. There's a really interesting counter-narrative that happens throughout Rabbit Proof Fence, and it happens throughout the writing of the original memoir as well. This is based on a memoir. It's written and made by a New Zealand writer, a non-Indigenous writer, and made by Philip Noyce, who's an Australian filmmaker but had been outside of Australia for most of his career, had come back to make Rabbit Proof Fence with a bit of an agenda, he would say. It is a somewhat problematic film from my perspective. It's certainly one of the key issues, is one that I raised in the last video, and that's the idea of the children being kind of naive performers. This notion that we saw that Chevelle used with Kynoch Monks as well, this idea that they would somehow just be able to do it naturally, and that we just needed to find somebody who looked the part, and then we'd turn them into actors, and then maybe they'd find it culturally difficult, and some of that is pretty problematic. This is played out in the interview that you'll see linked below this. Rabbit Proof Fence, though, is really important because it tells a couple of important narratives to the general audience. It also had an international following. It was released internationally, one of the first films that was about Aboriginal people that did. There were certainly some films before that, Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. There's a couple of problematic films before that did as well. And and certainly Walkabout. So there had been some representations, but none of them had the strong Aboriginal voice. And certainly that is found in Rabbit Proof Fence, even if there are some issues with it around who owns the voice all the time. The voice is still there. The story is still there. And it is a story of dispossession. It's a story. It's a stolen generation story, and I think one of the more important things about this story is that it was one that a lot of Australians didn't know. So I think it served a particular purpose. What was happening at the same time as a few years before that was that there was a film that was made called Radiance. Now, it had been play-built with Louis Nowra, who's a non-Indigenous playwright, but it had been built along with the performers who were performing in the original play, and the film itself was made by Rachel Perkins, who you'd recall is the director of Brand New Day. Radiance is a really interesting film, and it's actually a film that's around the idea of what it means to be a parent and what it means to be a sister. And so there's some really interesting family dynamics that are in there, but it's also so essentially an Aboriginal story. I don't mean that it's not relatable to non-Indigenous people, I believe it is, but it is a story that is essentially about Aboriginal people. And it didn't have the same kind of showing and outing. It's actually it's really interesting. It's a film that can happen in one room. It doesn't, but it can. It's very much a play that's been shot. but the way that it was shot is, I mean, there's a scene in it, if you haven't seen it yet, that's actually spectacular that could not be inside. And it's, and it's powerful in terms of what it does. It talks about challenging and in a very direct way the horrors of colonization. And yet it's also about forming and reforming families. So it's incredibly powerful film, and really I bet that most of you had never heard of it before this, because it just doesn't have that wide a showing. Beautifully performed, really nicely written, and worth a look-see. But does an audience want something as subtle as this, or do they need the bold statement that Rabbit Proof Fence is? And that's a really interesting moment to unpack as well. So moving on to a couple of other films that have certainly been incredibly powerful representations. I wanted to think about the relationship between two films in particular, and that's the 1976 version of Storm Boy, which may be a lot of people's first, people my age, first time that they'd seen an Aboriginal person on screen. And it was a very widely distributed film. It was a film that was aimed at kids. So it was an opportunity for kids to see Aboriginal representation, but it also represented the idea of the mythical Aboriginal person who was somehow not human and somehow not of the world. And so it is this kind of problematic framing. If you compare that and think about that in relationship to 10 Canoes, and, again, seeing the Gulpilil connection, there's a really interesting way that 10 Canoes challenges that, uses that, and absolutely challenges it, absolutely pushes the boundaries of what that can be. And it's really worth thinking about how that plays out. And at the same time, I would say that the representations that you see in Storm Boy are actually really interesting. They're not the problematic Jeddah. There is joy and humour in the character that we see, and in the characters and in the interplay and in the relationship. But it still does drag out the trope of, the black adult friend of the child, who's somehow spiritual and a leader. This is a trope that we see again and again in film. Maybe you can think of some other representations of it. It doesn't have to be in the context of Australia. And it might be something that you want to play around with and think about. 10 Canoes is interesting because it's in language, and it's interesting because the way that the language is used is to challenge some of these ideas of the importance of humour, the importance of what's valued. And so, really pitching a very different ontology than people expect to see in an Australian film. And so in that way, it's a break from the idea of the hero narrative that we see in Storm Boy. And I think then when we look at that film and compare it to some of the other films that we'll look at in the next lot, and in the next lot we're going to look at film and TV. We're going to look at some screen representations in the television area, in part because we've seen much more of a resurgence in, or in fact an investment, a new investment in the development of television and television programs, and we've seen a massive amount more films and TV shows by Aboriginal people. In some ways, this has a direct relationship to funding and processes behind the development of NITV, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next one too. Next one's got Brand New Day, Sapphires. We're going to talk a little bit about Samson and Delilah, and then we're going to go through a couple of other series, including Clever Man and The Gods of Wheat Street. Okay, see you in the next one.